The rain lashed against the grimy window of the high-rise apartment, each drop a tiny, percussive beat against the city's silent hum. It was the only sound, a constant, low-frequency white noise that filled the cavernous emptiness of the room. A chill seeped in from the glass, a faint, cold whisper of the storm outside. Elias Thorne sat in the half-dark, a ghost in his own life. He was a professional, a living weapon in a world of silent wars. His past was a classified document, his future an open assignment. The only constant was the cold, sterile light of the terminal in front of him, a single flickering beacon in the gloom. A new message blinked. A single amber cursor, the only sign of life on the black screen. Encrypted, level 4 clearance. He didn't flinch. His fingers, long and scarred, moved with a practiced, almost surgical precision over the keys. The sound was a low, staccato tap-tap-tap, barely audible above the drumming rain. He entered the key sequence. A series of swirling geometric patterns, the visual representation of an unbreakable cipher, danced across the screen before dissolving. The display flashed once, a blinding white light that made his pupils contract, and a single file appeared. Jericho Sanction. The letters were stark, bold, and final. The name meant one thing: a termination order, sanctioned at the highest level of his agency. A sanction to kill. The terminal's internal speakers hissed, a low, modulated whisper breaking the silence. A voice, familiar yet devoid of warmth, spoke from the machine. "Elias, we have a clean target. No collateral. No extraction. The sanction is absolute." Elias said nothing, his gaze fixed on the screen. He knew the voice. It was Operator 1, his liaison, a man he had never met, a voice he knew better than his own family's. "Confirm receipt," the voice commanded.
"Understood," Elias replied, his voice a low, gravelly murmur. His emotions were a cold, dead weight in his stomach, a feeling he had cultivated for a decade. He felt nothing, not dread, not excitement, just the familiar weight of a task. The target's name appeared: Viktor Malek, an arms dealer. A grainy photo with a predatory smile filled the screen, a face that belonged in a gilded cage, not a morgue. The face of a man who dealt in death and walked away clean. Malek's eyes seemed to follow him, a slick, unsettling gaze. Elias felt a flicker of something in his gut, a mix of adrenaline and quiet resolve, but he suppressed it immediately. He looked at the face on the screen, a stranger he was now sworn to erase. His jaw was set, eyes devoid of emotion. He felt nothing but the weight of the task. The file continued, detailing Malek's movements, his last known location being a high-end charity gala in Monaco. The mission was simple, brutal, and entirely in Elias's wheelhouse. "Malek's security detail is minimal," Operator 1 continued, the voice a ghost in the air. "The gala is a soft target. Infiltration is an invitation. You will move as a ghost, a whisper. You will not be seen. The sanction to kill is the only instruction." Elias closed his eyes for a brief, fleeting moment, picturing the layout of the gala. He could almost feel the cold steel of his weapon in his hand. The weight of his own existence, of being a weapon in a world of silent wars, was a familiar comfort. He was a paradox, a man who lived to kill and who had to die to live. He was nothing but a tool, a sanctioned tool. "Any last words, Elias?" Operator 1 asked. Elias's hand was already on the command to close the file. He paused for a beat, his jaw clenched so tight he could feel the muscles ache. The only thing he felt was the cold, unyielding resolve of a man who had long ago buried his conscience. He had to be a ghost, a whisper, a force of nature. "No," he replied, the single word a final, absolute declaration. He closed the file, the screen returning to black. The city outside was a blurred mosaic of lights. The rain lashed against the window. He was already gone.
Monaco. The air was thick with the scent of salt water and old money, a heady mix of opulence and a quiet, ancient decay. Elias moved through the ballroom, a predator disguised as a guest. The tuxedo was a foreign skin, a garment meant to conceal, not protect. Every thread felt like a lie. He was a man of shadows, but here, under the blinding glare of crystal chandeliers, he was forced to perform. He moved fluidly, his posture relaxed, a smile on his face that never reached his eyes. His earpiece, a tiny, almost invisible piece of tech, was a constant, low-frequency hum, feeding him information from a network of surveillance assets. He didn't hear the chatter, he processed it. Every hushed conversation about stock portfolios and summer yachts was filtered through his mind, searching for the one discordant note, the one word that didn't belong. The chattering shifted. The name Malek began to pepper the conversations. He's here, just arrived. The man is a king. Elias's heart rate, a steady, controlled metronome, didn't so much as flicker. His eyes scanned the crowd, his gaze cutting through the false joviality. He wasn't looking for a face, he was looking for a pattern. He found it near the bar, a man with a distinct, jagged scar on his cheek, a known associate of Malek's inner circle. The man wasn't laughing or mingling. He was watching the door, his posture tense, his eyes darting, a subtle sign of an imminent arrival. Elias felt a quiet satisfaction. The intelligence was sound. The target was close. A woman approached him, a cascade of emerald silk draped over her figure, reflecting the light like a cut gemstone. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, met his with a sudden, unnerving directness. There was a hint of amusement in her smile, but her eyes were far too serious. "You look lost," she said, her voice a low, melodic purr. Elias managed a slight, almost imperceptible tilt of his head, a gesture of politeness that gave nothing away. "Just admiring the architecture," he replied, his voice a low, gravelly murmur. He was a ghost, a whisper. He knew how to blend into the background, to be a man no one remembered. But this woman was looking at him as if she knew his name. Her smile widened, but the amusement in her eyes was replaced with something else, a flicker of recognition, a challenge. "It's a magnificent prison, isn't it?" she said, her tone suddenly serious, the purr gone. "All this gold and marble, it makes you feel like you're on top of the world when you're just trapped inside." Elias's eyes narrowed, a fraction of a millimeter. He felt a shiver of unease, a cold sensation that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He was being watched. He was being played. This wasn't a random encounter. He slowly turned his attention back to the crowd, his face a mask of disinterest, his mind racing. Who was she? Was this a trap? And then he saw him. Viktor Malek. Surrounded by a small, unsmiling entourage, Malek was a whirlwind of theatrical laughter. He was holding court, a king among courtiers. But Malek's eyes, a pair of cold, gray stones, were not on the fawning crowd. They were on Elias. The boisterous smile on Malek's face was gone in an instant. His expression was one of knowing, of something deeper than recognition. It was a look of shared understanding, a silent communication between two men who knew exactly who and what they were. Elias felt his blood run cold. This wasn't a target. This was a man who was expecting him. Malek raised his hand in a subtle, almost unnoticeable gesture, a gentle wave. The scarred man disappeared into the crowd with a practiced, almost invisible efficiency. Elias's senses screamed. The mission was a lie. The target was a setup. The chill of an unseen hand on his neck was suddenly a very real, very physical thing. He was the one walking into the trap. Elias moved, the instinct of a hunter taking over. He slipped through the crowd, a shadow in a tuxedo, heading for the terrace where Malek had just stepped out. The sounds of the party faded behind him, replaced by the gentle lapping of the ocean against the rocks far below. The air on the terrace was cooler, sharper. A salt-tinged breeze stirred the potted plants. Malek stood by the railing, a cigarette in hand, a plume of smoke curling around his head like a spectral halo. He looked calm, almost resigned. There was a profound melancholy in his posture, the shoulders slumped just so. It wasn't the look of a man about to die, but a man who had already grieved. "I knew you'd come," Malek said without turning. His voice was a soft rumble, a surprising contrast to the bluster Elias had seen inside. Elias's hand went to the small, silenced pistol tucked into the back of his waistband, his fingers curling around the cold steel. The motion was a reflex, a decade of muscle memory. "Jericho Sanction. It's nothing personal," Elias said, his voice flat, a low, guttural murmur that was a lie from the moment it left his lips. There was nothing more personal than being sent to erase another human being. Malek finally turned, the moonlight catching the lines of a tired, knowing face. His expression wasn't one of fear, but of profound sadness, as if he were looking at a ghost. "They told you I was an arms dealer? A dangerous man?" he asked, his voice soft, almost a whisper. A cloud of vapor escaped his lips. "The files don't lie," Elias said. The words a practiced lie, a mantra he'd repeated for a decade. It was the only way to do his work, to believe in the truth of the file. Malek's smile was a wry, sad curl of his lips. He shook his head slowly. "They do when they're written by a ghost," he said. He took a drag from his cigarette, the tip glowing a dull orange in the dark. "The Jericho Sanction isn't for me, Elias." He paused, his gaze piercing. "It's a test for you." Elias's grip on the pistol tightened, the cold metal digging into his skin. His breath hitched, a faint gasp of disbelief. "A test?" he scoffed, the word a strained, humorless sound. "My life is a constant test." Malek's eyes met his, clear and unblinking, his gaze holding an almost painful depth. He dropped his cigarette, the butt a faint red ember on the marble floor. "The person you are really meant to eliminate is yourself," he said, his voice a quiet punch to Elias's gut. "The sanction is a setup, a purge. They want you dead, not me." Elias's mind reeled. It was an impossibility. An agency betrayal was the one thing he had never prepared for, a breach of faith so fundamental it unmade the world he lived in. His jaw was locked, his eyes wide, searching Malek's face for any sign of a lie, a flicker of deceit. But there was nothing there but a deep, chilling resignation, a quiet understanding of his own fate. Malek reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metallic flash drive. "This is the proof," he said, holding it out. "The sanction is a setup. They want you dead, not me. They've been setting you up for months. The botched mission in Prague, the leak in Istanbul, it was all to build a case against you, to make you a liability. Your own people are coming to put you down, and they'll call it a cleanup." Elias's mind was a maelstrom of thoughts and feelings he hadn't allowed himself to have in years. Betrayal, fury, a cold, hollow pit of despair. He looked at the flash drive, then at Malek's face. His breath caught in his throat, a sound he hadn't made in years. The world tilted on its axis. Everything he had believed was a lie. Before Elias could process the information, the night exploded into chaos. The sudden, violent crack of a high-powered rifle ripped through the humid air. The sound was not the muffled pop of a silenced pistol, but a deafening, terrifying report that echoed off the surrounding buildings. It was a sniper shot,
A declaration of war. The bullet slammed into the ornate marble railing where Malek had just been standing, a grotesque spatter of stone and dust erupting where his chest had been a split second before. The impact was so jarring it made Elias's teeth ache. The crowd, a moment ago a sea of elegant laughing faces, became a screaming, panicked mob. Guests screamed, scattering like frightened birds. A woman in a red gown tripped, her drink flying from her hand, the crystal glass shattering on the floor. The band stopped mid-note, the silence left behind even more deafening than the gunshot. Elias's training took over. He wasn't thinking, he was reacting. He lunged, tackling Malek to the ground just as another round went off, this one a sharp, percussive crack that slammed into a nearby pillar. The air was a maelstrom of terrified shouts and the shrill blare of sirens in the distance. Malek scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and grim understanding. Elias, his senses on high alert, saw the small, ominous red dot of a sniper's laser on a nearby building. It was sweeping, searching. "They're not my men," Malek grunted, his voice a strained whisper as he pointed toward the door. "It's your people, your own strike team." Elias's blood ran cold. The thought was impossible. His agency, his unit, was an elite, disciplined force. They would never turn on one of their own. Unless... The gnawing doubt that had been planted by the flash drive now blossomed into a horrifying, all-consuming fear. It was the only explanation. The sniper wasn't hunting Malek, he was hunting them both. He and Malek raced across the terrace, taking cover behind a large decorative planter. A squad of black-clad operatives stormed onto the terrace from the main ballroom doors, their weapons raised. They were a vision of death in motion, a force of nature. They weren't wearing the standard-issue tactical gear. Their suits were unmarked, their movements precise, their faces masked. Elias recognized the way they held their weapons, the way they moved as a single deadly unit. The silent hand signals, the perfect spacing, the cold efficiency. It was the training he'd endured. It was his own. His heart pounded in his ears, a frantic drumbeat of betrayal. He felt a searing rage, a gut-wrenching fury that dwarfed all other emotions. They were not an enemy force, they were his brothers in arms. He knew their faces, he knew their names. He had shared meals and missions with these men. He saw the way one of them, a man he knew only as Sparrow, moved with a lethal grace, aiming his weapon not to kill, but to maim, to flush them out. It was a tactic they had perfected in training. It was designed to keep the target from escaping, to corner them for the final brutal takedown. "We have to go," Malek yelled over the din, his voice strained with urgency. "They're not trying to kill us from here, they're hurting us." Elias nodded, his expression a mask of cold fury. The rage was a white-hot coal in his chest, burning away the doubt and the fear. He returned fire, his shots aimed at the legs and shoulders, covering their escape. He was a professional, and he knew how to survive a fight. But this wasn't a fight. This was a purge, and he was the one they had come to cleanse. He was a ghost, a whisper, a man who didn't exist, and he had been a fool to think he was anything else. They were on the run, a strange, mismatched pair. Malek, the supposed arms dealer, and Elias, the operative now hunted by his own unit. The sedan, a sleek black vehicle stolen from the valet stand, sped down a coastal highway. The dashboard glowed with a faint, ghostly green light that did nothing to illuminate the storm of emotions on Elias's face. He was pale with shock, a rare sight. The cold, unyielding resolve he had worn for a decade had cracked, revealing a raw, human fragility underneath. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, as if trying to hold his world together with his bare hands. The hum of the engine was a low, constant drone, a white noise against the violent, chaotic storm in his mind. He was silent for a long moment, the only sounds the whir of the tires on the asphalt and the whistling of the wind against the windows. Finally, the word came out, a strained rasp. "Why?" It was a single syllable, yet it carried a decade of sacrifice, a lifetime of brutal, unquestioning faith. It was a word that demanded an answer, a reason for a betrayal so profound it had unmade him. Malek sighed, a heavy, tired sound that seemed to carry the weight of a world. His face was a roadmap of deep lines and weariness, etched with a quiet sadness that Elias was only now beginning to understand. "Because I'm not who they said I was," he explained, his voice a low, modulated tone. "I'm a whistleblower. I was building a case against a high-ranking official within your agency. I was going to expose him for what he is, a rogue player, a traitor, selling off intelligence and assets, building his own private army." The information hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. A rogue player, a traitor. His mind reeled. The agency was his life. It was his purpose. The thought of a viper in the nest, a monster hiding in plain sight, it was an impossibility he had never allowed himself to entertain. He was a weapon, and weapons don't question the hand that holds them. But now that hand was a fist, and it was turning on him. His hands were still clamped on the steering wheel, but now they trembled, the small, involuntary motion a testament to his shattered control. "Who?" he asked, his voice a low growl, the word heavy with a cold, simmering fury. He was no longer asking for a reason, he was demanding a name.
Malek paused, his eyes sad, his gaze meeting Elias's in the faint glow of the dashboard. "Your mentor, Thorne, Director Harrison Kane." The name hit Elias like a physical blow. The name of the man who had found him, trained him, and molded him into the ghost he was today. The man who had given him his purpose, his life. The man he had looked up to as a father figure. The man who had been the last, unshakable pillar of his shattered existence. "No," Elias whispered, the single word a protest against a reality he couldn't accept. It was a sound torn from his soul, a desperate plea for the world to return to what it was, a protest against a truth too painful to bear. Malek shook his head, his gaze unwavering, his expression one of profound sympathy. "The Jericho Sanction, it was a way to get you out of the way, to make it look like a botched mission. They'd hunt you down, and no one would ever question what really happened. You were a pawn. A very dangerous pawn." Malek took a deep breath, the sound of air filling his lungs a sharp contrast to the silence in the car. They leaked the intel on the Prague mission. They sabotaged the operation in Istanbul. It was all a trail of breadcrumbs, a way to make you a liability, to build a case against you, to make you disposable. They're coming to put you down, Elias, and they'll call it a cleanup. Elias stared out at the passing landscape, the neon glow of the city lights replaced by the pitch-black darkness of the open highway. His jaw was clenched so tight he thought it might shatter. His world, his entire purpose, had just been reduced to a lie. The years of unquestioning service, the missions, the blood he had shed, the lives he had taken, it was all for nothing. It was all for a lie. The silence in the car was deafening, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the roar of a betrayal so profound, so absolute, it eclipsed every other emotion. Elias was a ghost, a whisper, a man who didn't exist, and he had been a fool to think he was anything else. The only way to prove Malek's story was to get to the source. The flash drive he'd given Elias was just a key, a small piece of a much larger puzzle. The real data, Malek explained, was hidden in a server farm in a remote, abandoned warehouse in Croatia. They had no choice but to get there. They ditched the stolen sedan for a nondescript, beat-up transport truck, its engine a low, unhappy rumble. The interior smelled of stale coffee and diesel, a stark contrast to the scent of opulence they had just left behind. They drove for hours, the miles stretching out before them in a blur of black asphalt and unlit landscape. Elias was a master of evasion, a shadow on the grid, but he felt the heat. The digital trail he'd left behind, the very one his former masters had taught him to erase, was like a trail of breadcrumbs for a hunter. He knew his former team, the men he had trained with, were already on his tail, a pack of wolves sniffing out their prey. As they drove, Malek described the scope of Kane's operation. It wasn't just about money, it was about power. "He sees himself as a god, Thorne," Malek said, his voice laced with a mixture of fear and contempt. "He thinks he's above the law, above everyone. What I found, it's a parallel shadow government. He's been building it for years, selling off intelligence and assets to the highest bidder, building his own private army." Elias said nothing, his face a mask of stone. He was processing. Every lesson, every mission, every sacrifice he had made. Had it all been for this man's twisted dream? His emotions were a cold, hard knot in his stomach. The betrayal was absolute. He stared out the cracked window, watching the landscape fly by, a blur of trees and empty fields. He thought of the faces of his team, the men who had just hunted him down. Were they aware of what they were doing? Were they just cogs in Kane's machine, or were they complicit in his brutal, amoral agenda? He felt a deep, wrenching sadness, the kind that came with the death of a belief. His entire life had been a lie, a carefully constructed fiction designed to serve a monster. "He's the architect of the sanction, Thorne," Malek continued, his voice a low, modulated hum. "The Jericho Sanction wasn't just a mission, it was a test, a way to see if you were worthy. He wanted to see if you would fall for the bait, if you would follow the orders, no matter how absurd, if you were a good soldier. And you were. Too good, perhaps." Elias's hands were clamped on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "What did you do to get on his radar?" he asked, his voice a low growl. Malek let out a short, hollow laugh. "I did what you're doing now. I started to ask questions. I was a technician. I worked on the agency's comms. I saw the encrypted messages, the data transfers. They didn't make sense. So I dug deeper, and I found him." The mention of the encrypted messages, of the very technology Elias used to communicate with Operator 1, sent a shiver down his spine. The cold logic of the betrayal, the intricate web of deceit, was starting to unravel. He looked at the flash drive on the seat between them, a small, innocuous piece of plastic that held the key to his freedom and his vengeance. "Why didn't you go to the authorities?" Elias asked, his voice strained. "Why come to me?" Malek's sad eyes met his. "Because there is no authority above him, Thorne. Not anymore. He has his people in every branch of government, every intelligence agency. He's a ghost in the machine. He's everywhere." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I came to you because you're the only one who could stop him. You are the only one he couldn't control, the only one who could see the truth." Elias was silent again. The silence this time not of shock, but of a quiet, simmering rage. He thought of his mentor, the man who had taught him how to live, how to survive. He thought of the paternal affection, the quiet words of encouragement, the long hours of training. It was all a performance, a carefully crafted lie, a way to create the perfect weapon, a ghost he could use to erase his enemies. And when the ghost became too dangerous, he would simply erase it. The betrayal was so profound it was almost beautiful in its cold, brutal logic. He was a pawn, a very dangerous pawn. He had been a fool to think he was anything else. He looked at Malek, the supposed arms dealer, and saw not a criminal, but a kindred spirit, a man who had seen the truth and risked everything to expose it. They were both ghosts now, both hunted by the same machine. "We have to get this data out," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "We have to show the world what he's doing." The words were no longer a question. They were a statement of intent. The sadness was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline resolve.
He was not a victim. He was a weapon. "We let them come to us," he said, a faint, humorless smile on his lips. "We let them come to us. It's time for a reckoning." The warehouse was a skeletal ruin, a relic of a failed industrial age. The silence inside was broken only by the drip of rainwater and their own hushed movements. The air, heavy with the stench of rust and decay, felt thick in their lungs. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every gust of wind against the corrugated metal a potential footstep. Elias moved like a shadow, his senses heightened, his pistol now a familiar weight in his hand. He was a hunter on his own territory, but now he was the one being hunted. He felt the cold air on his neck, a phantom touch that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. "They're close," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "I can feel them." Malek, a small, unassuming man who had spent his life in the digital world, was a world away from this brutal reality. His face was a mask of sheer terror, a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice a strained whisper. Elias didn't answer. He just held up a hand, a silent command for Malek to stop. The warehouse was an open wound, and they were caught in its gut. They found the server room, a small, heavily shielded bunker within the larger structure. Its reinforced steel door was a testament to the sensitive nature of what was stored inside. Malek's hands, trembling with a mix of fear and adrenaline, worked on the access panel, his fingers a blur of motion. "It's a biometric lock," he muttered, his eyes glued to the display. "I need to spoof a retinal scan." Elias stood guard, his gaze fixed on the entrance. He felt the tension in the air, the silent hum of an approaching storm. He saw it first, a flicker of light from a neighboring building, a lens flare. A sniper! Elias yelled a warning, his voice a sharp, percussive crack in the silence, pushing Malek to the ground just as the glass above them shattered. The sound was deafening, a violent explosion of splintered glass and dust. The team was here. Their faces, though masked, were familiar to Elias. He knew their tactics, their movements. They were his brothers in arms. He felt a deep, wrenching pain. He fired, his shots aimed at disabling, not killing. He was trying to protect the very men who were hunting him. One of them, a man with a distinct limp he knew from training, went down with a shot to the knee. Another, a silent, deadly figure he knew as Wraith, fell with a shot to the shoulder. He was trying to preserve them, to bring them back from the brink of this betrayal. But they were relentless. "I'm in!" Malek yelled, his voice strained with urgency. The server room door hissed open. They scrambled inside, the cold, sterile air a sudden shock after the damp, humid air of the warehouse. Malek worked on the server, his fingers flying over the keys, his movements a desperate, frantic dance of pure efficiency. He plugged in the flash drive. The data began to transfer. The progress bar on the screen, a slow, agonizing crawl, was a ticking clock. Elias held them off, his movements a dance of controlled violence. He was a ghost, a blur of motion. He used the very training Kane had given him against his own men. He moved with a brutal, disarming grace, his shots aimed at disabling, not killing. He was trying to protect the very men who were hunting him. He saw the cold, unyielding resolve in their eyes, the practiced efficiency of a unit that had long ago buried its conscience. He saw himself in their faces, and the realization was a gut-wrenching, agonizing truth. He was no longer fighting against them. He was fighting against himself. He was fighting against the ghost he had become. The progress bar was at 50%. The sounds of battle were all around him. The crack of gunfire, the hiss of shattered glass, the low, guttural grunts of his former teammates. He was a ghost in the machine, fighting against the very system he had helped to build. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Elias was a blur of motion, his shots aimed at their limbs and shoulders, trying to stop them without causing permanent damage. But they were relentless. They were an unyielding force of nature. The progress bar was at 70%. A man he knew as Echo, a silent, deadly figure with a scar above his eye, went down with a shot to the leg. Elias felt a pang of profound sadness, a deep, wrenching pain in his gut. They were not an enemy force. They were his brothers in arms. He knew their faces. They knew their names. He had shared meals and missions with these men. He saw the way they moved, the way they held their weapons, the cold efficiency. It was the training he'd endured. It was his own. The progress bar was at 90%. The team, their numbers reduced but their resolve unwavering, stormed the server room. Elias moved with a desperate grace, his shots aimed at disabling, not killing. The data finished transferring. The screen flashed once, a blinding white light that made his pupils contract. "It's done," Malek whispered, his voice strained with a mix of fear and relief. "We have to go, now." They were out of time. They had to go. Elias looked at the faces of his former teammates, a mask of cold fury on his face. He was no longer a victim. He was a weapon. "We let them come to us," he said, a faint, humorless smile on his lips. "We let them come to us. It's time for a reckoning." Elias and Malek made it to a safe house, a small, isolated cabin in the mountains. The single room was sparse, lit only by the flickering glow of a laptop screen and the dying embers of a small fireplace. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, a mournful, echoing cry. Inside, the silence was thick with the weight of the truth. Elias sat hunched over the laptop, the single tear he'd shed on the drive, now a dry, stinging line on his cheek. The screen was a horrifying tableau of betrayal. It was more than financial records and communication logs. It was a complete digital map of Kane's network. He saw names he recognized, faces of men he had trained with, all implicated in the conspiracy. Kill orders with his signature on them, but with the target's name switched from Malek to him. Every mission, every victory, every moment of self-righteousness was a lie. He saw the photos of the whistleblowers, their faces ghostly and pale, a grim reminder of a fate he had almost shared. He stared at the screen, his face a mask of profound despair. It was a betrayal so absolute it had stripped him of everything, his purpose, his identity, his very soul. "It's all here," Malek whispered, his voice a strained, hollow rasp. He had a flask in his hand, a small, almost comforting weight. He offered it to Elias. "The proof, the entire network. He's been building this for years." Elias just shook his head, his eyes glued to the screen, a single horrifying entry drawing his attention. It was a kill order, his final assignment, to eliminate himself. "He was going to frame me for it," Elias said, his voice a low, guttural murmur. "He was going to make it look like I was a rogue agent, a traitor. He was going to put a bullet in my head, and no one would ever question what really happened." Elias's jaw was locked so tight he thought his teeth might shatter. He felt a deep, gut-wrenching fury, a white-hot coal of rage that threatened to consume him. He wasn't just a victim. He was a ghost, a pawn, a man who had sacrificed his life for a lie. Suddenly, a twig snapped outside. The sound, a small, insignificant thing, was a thunderclap in the oppressive silence. Elias's head snapped up, his body tensing, his hand instinctively going to the pistol at his waistband. Malek's face, pale and drawn, was now a mask of sheer terror. His eyes, wide with a quiet, chilling finality, met Elias's. "They're here," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Elias listened, his senses heightened, his heart a frantic drumbeat in his ears. He heard the telltale rustle of a man in the brush, the faint, almost imperceptible scuff of a boot on stone.
They had found them. The digital trail he'd left behind, the very one his former masters had taught him to erase, had led them right to him. Elias's mind went blank. The despair, the sadness, the rage, it was all gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline resolve. He wasn't a victim. He was a weapon. The years of training, the discipline he had cultivated, had all led to this one moment. He stood up, his posture a quiet, dangerous thing. He was a force of nature, a hurricane in a man's body. He grabbed his pack, his mind now clear. "They're here," he repeated, but this time his voice was not a whisper of fear, but a low, dangerous growl. He wasn't running anymore. He was a hunter on his own territory. "Elias, we can't fight them," Malek said, his voice strained with urgency. "There's too many of them. We have to run. We can still get this data out. We can still expose him." Elias just shook his head, his expression a mask of cold fury. He looked at Malek, the supposed arms dealer, and saw not a criminal, but a kindred spirit. A man who had seen the truth and risked everything to expose it. They were both ghosts now, both hunted by the same machine. "No," Elias said, his voice a low, guttural murmur. "We're not running anymore. We let them come to us. We end this now." He was a man who had been defined by his past, by the lies he had been told. But now, in this moment of profound, absolute betrayal, he was finally free. He was free to choose his own path. He was free to choose his own fight. He was a ghost, a whisper, a man who didn't exist, and he had been a fool to think he was anything else. "It's time for a reckoning," he said, his voice a chilling whisper in the dark. The cabin door was a silent, unmoving thing for a long moment before the latch clicked with a soft, ominous finality. The sound was a hammer blow in the oppressive silence of the room. Elias, standing like a statue, his senses screaming with an animalistic intensity, watched as the door swung inward. But it wasn't a squad of masked operatives who stepped into the dim light of the cabin. It was a single man. Director Harrison Kane. He was alone. He walked into the room with a calm, deliberate gait, his movements a picture of quiet confidence, a king surveying his domain. His face, usually a mask of calm authority, held a complex expression, a mix of pride, disappointment, and a strange, almost paternal sadness. He was dressed not in tactical gear, but in a tailored suit, as if he had just left a board meeting. It was a deliberate choice, a way to show his power, to show that he was above the brutal reality of their world. He stopped in the center of the room, his gaze fixed on Elias. He ignored Malek, as if he were a ghost, a non-entity. "Elias," he said, his voice soft, almost affectionate, the sound a strange, unholy contrast to the violence that had just transpired. "You've disappointed me, but I'm not surprised. You've always had a problem with authority." Elias's hands were clenched into fists, his knuckles white against his pale skin. A single, agonizing question, heavy with a decade of sacrifice, burned on his lips. "Why, Director?" he asked, the words strained with emotion. "You were my family." A faint, theatrical sigh escaped Kane's lips. He took a step closer, his eyes a pair of dark, unblinking pools of profound contempt. "Family is a weakness, Elias. What I'm building is a world where there are no weaknesses, where there is only order. I am building a world that is safe, for the few of us who are strong enough to rule it." His gaze shifted to Malek, a flicker of cold, surgical dismissal in his eyes. "This man, he's a relic, a whistleblower, a coward, a fool." Malek flinched at the insult, his face a mask of shock and outrage. "I am a patriot," he stammered, his voice a desperate, strained whisper. I was trying to save my country from a monster."
Kane's laugh was a cold, humorless sound, a mockery of all joy. "A patriot? A fool with a conscience is what you are. A dangerous thing, a conscience. It leads to anarchy, to chaos. It leads to people like you. And people like you are a liability." He turned his attention back to Elias, his gaze filled with a complex, almost agonizing mixture of paternal affection and cold, brutal logic. "You, Elias, you are strong. You are like me. The Jericho Sanction, it was a test, a crucible to see if you were worthy. I didn't give you a test. I gave you a choice. I wanted to see if you would follow your orders to the letter, or if you would see the lies, if you would follow the truth. I wanted to see if you were a pawn or a king." The words hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. The betrayal was so deep, so profound, it unmade the very core of his being. He had been a fool. He had blindly followed orders, believing in a cause that was a lie. The missions, the bloodshed, the lives he had taken, it was all for this man's twisted ambition. His rage, a white-hot coal, threatened to consume him. He wanted to scream. He wanted to rage. He wanted to put a bullet in this man's head. But instead, his mind went cold, a dangerous, crystalline calm washing over him. He was a weapon. He had been a fool to think he was anything else. "And what about the men you sent?" Elias asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "The men I trained with? Did you test them too? Did they know they were coming to kill their brother?" A fleeting, almost imperceptible flicker of genuine sadness crossed Kane's face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Sacrifice is a prerequisite for progress, Elias. They were good men, but they were pawns. They had to be eliminated. You were different. You had the potential to be a god. Join me, Elias. We can rule this world together." The Jericho Sanction was a test, a way to see if you were worthy. Join me, and we can rule the world together. He held out a hand, the gesture a strange, almost paternal offer. Elias stared at the outstretched hand, the hand that had trained him, molded him, and ultimately betrayed him. He thought of his team, the men he had just fought, the men who had been used as a tool to hunt him down. He thought of the sacrifices he had made, the blood he had shed, the lives he had taken. He was a ghost, a whisper, a force of nature, but he was also a man, and a man had a choice. He was a king. He was not a pawn. He was no longer a victim. He was a weapon. He was a king. He had been a fool to think he was anything else. He looked at Malek, the supposed arms dealer, and saw not a criminal, but a kindred spirit, a man who had seen the truth and risked everything to expose it. They were both ghosts now, both hunted by the same machine.
Elias's silence was his answer. The words had been said. The truth had been revealed. The air in the cabin, thick with the scent of pine and betrayal, was now filled with the unspoken weight of a decision. Elias's rage, a white-hot coal that had burned in his gut, was now a cold, crystalline resolve. He had been a puppet, a ghost, a weapon wielded by a monster, but no more. He looked at the man he had once called a mentor, and he saw nothing but a monster. He shook his head slowly, the motion filled with a profound sense of loss and finality. "I'm not like you, Kane," he said, his voice low and dangerous, a whisper of a final, unbreakable promise. "I don't kill for power. I don't betray my brothers." Kane's expression hardened, a mask of calm authority replacing the fleeting glimpse of emotion. "Then you have chosen your path, Elias, the wrong one." The fight was not a battle for survival, it was a reckoning. Kane, for all his intellectual cunning, was an old warrior, a master of 1,000 arts. He moved with a brutal, practiced grace, his movements designed to overwhelm and break. But Elias was a ghost, a blur of motion. His movements were not for power, not for vengeance, but for justice. He was fighting for his past, for the man he thought he was. He was fighting for the truth. He was a dancer in a world of violence, his every step a precise, lethal motion. Kane lunged, a swift, brutal attack aimed at Elias's throat. Elias ducked, the air whistling past his ear, his own movement a fluid, almost beautiful counterstrike. He used the very training Kane had given him against him, the lessons of speed, efficiency, and brutal precision. Kane's face, a mask of cold fury, was now a picture of pure, unadulterated shock. He had underestimated Elias, the boy he had molded into a ghost. He had believed he had total control, but you cannot control a weapon that has learned how to think. Elias disarmed him, his movements fluid and precise, a dance of pure efficiency. The click of the safety, the metallic clang of Kane's weapon on the floor, was a final, absolute declaration. Elias brought Kane to the ground, his forearm pressed against his throat. The pressure was firm, unyielding, but not enough to kill. Not yet. Elias's eyes, a pair of dark, unforgiving pools, met Kane's, a final, unblinking gaze that held no hatred, no anger, just a profound, chilling finality. "It's over," Elias said, his voice a whisper, the sound of a closing chapter. Malek, a small, unassuming man, stood over them, holding the data drive. His hands, a moment ago trembling with fear, were now steady, a testament to his newfound resolve. "The world will know the truth now," he said, his voice shaky but firm, the words a promise. The information was already being uploaded, a digital grenade ready to expose a powerful conspiracy. The world would soon know what happened. They would know about the Jericho Sanction. They would know about the monster who had betrayed them all. Elias released Kane, his expression one of a man who had just walked through a fire, burned but not broken. He stood up, looking at Malek. They were no longer an operative and a whistleblower. They were allies, comrades, two ghosts in the machine who had just exposed the architect of a silent, brutal war. They had no home, no past, no future. Not yet. They walked out of the cabin, the sun on the horizon, a brilliant, beautiful ball of fire that cast a warm, golden glow on the frozen landscape. They walked into a new world, leaving the cold betrayal behind them. The world would never be the same, and neither would they.